Today's impactful guest is Rebecca Liron, who is a Washington, D.C.-based humanitarian response professional with 10 years of global experience working with UN agencies, NGOs, foundations, and research institutions as a protection expert in contexts of forced displacements. Hi, Rebecca. We're so excited to have you on the podcast today. Thank you so much. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me. How are you doing?
I'm great. I'm excited. We have so much to cover, so let's dive in. So I know
Dive
when
right
we
in.
chatted a little bit when we were planning your podcast, and you mentioned that you actually have a few moments of impact,
Yeah.
which is great. It means you're living that impactful life. But let's start with maybe the earliest one. So, Rebecca, what is your earliest moment of impact?
Yeah, no, thank you. And thanks for giving me the space to speak about it. As you mentioned, I couldn't just stick to one. But I would say my earliest kind of moment or time of impact was when I was an undergraduate at Northwestern University, and at the time was working for the Center for Forced Migration Studies. And shout out to my advisor, Galya Ruffer, professor who's still there, but really inspired me and was doing a lot of research to support generally, forced migration research papers, the research of professors, but also asylum cases of those who were refugees in the US. So supporting their cases with country of origin research. And I just felt like at that point, I was so far from what I was researching and really was itching to get closer and to kind of be able to have more of an impact. So that was number one.
I love it. So, we've got a lot of young listeners, and I think it would be useful for you to share what did you think you were going to study when you decided to go to Northwestern? What was plan A?
Yeah, plan A. I mean, I was always interested in political science and international studies, but I really thought I was going to be a lawyer. Even in my bat mitzvah speech at 13, I said I was going to go to Harvard Law and be like a legally blonde situation. But yeah, I really thought like I was gearing up to go into law and didn't know what would that would look like. I think I had thoughts of, oh, maybe like international law, but I think it was a pretty common thing at the time for everyone to just be like, okay, this is a stepping stone to X school. So yeah, that was definitely plan A. And even when I graduated and did a fellowship, which brought me to Kenya, which is kind of getting into the second area of impact, but I thought I was only going to do that for 1 year before going to grad school, and everything kind of changed. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that because I think a lot of times younger people that are graduating college in this challenging job market and they're looking ahead and they look at people maybe 10 years ahead of them and think they had it all figured out. I think it's so useful for people to share how zigzag, how much serendipity there is in most people's career trajectory. So thanks for shining a light on that. So I actually want to stay at Northwestern for a minute because I think it's really interesting. So how did you develop an awareness of what the Center for Forced Migration was doing?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think it was kind of in my like freshman year. I would have to go back and remember further, but I think I went to one of the events that they hosted. And if I'm not mistaken, it was on the Democratic Republic of Congo and showcasing the stories of survivors of gender-based violence, which was connected to my later work. But yeah, really was kind of like a gallery with quotes on the wall and photos of women, and it really stuck out to me. And that was like a moment where I felt like, okay, this is like really striking a chord. I want to learn more about this. I outreached to the center to Professor Ruffer, who I mentioned earlier, and then set up an internship for my sophomore year, which is when, yeah, that kind of all started. And I think at the time I didn't really know much about forced migration at all. It was really just seeing the effects of it and kind of the human rights side and thinking like, okay, this is, a horrible thing in the world that's happening. How do I be some part of the solution?
I love that. That's such an empathetic frame to take, and you followed it up with your actions. So your research was looking at, I think you mentioned it earlier, country of origin asylum cases. How does that work? Tell us a little bit about that.
The durable solutions for them would be to integrate or to be resettled to another country or be able to return to their home country if they're able to. And another pathway for refugees is if they go to the US or another country directly, kind of bypassing that process, and then they, at the border or at the airport where they land, claim asylum. So then that kind of process of having their case approved for them to be able to stay happens once they arrive in the country. So we call those folks asylum seekers or refugees who are seeking asylum. So then it goes through like an adjudication process with immigration officers from the US government, and the asylum seeker is usually represented by a lawyer. So the professor that I mentioned is also a lawyer, so she would be, an expert witness to these cases for asylum seekers who were trying to prove, their right to stay as a refugee in the United States. So let's say someone was coming from Afghanistan, just for an example, providing information about what's happening in that country at the time, now and when they fled, if they're part of a social group that was targeted, like, women who are specifically targeted from X community. Again, this is just an example. We would kind of do the background research to give all of the facts that, validate their history of why they had to flee at that time.
Okay, great. So you could actually contribute to specific case histories to help facilitate their claims.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. So can you think of like a particular case that you were attached to? Like, were you able to ever trace someone that was, granted asylum, or it was a while ago, but
Yeah, so for those cases, I wasn't, just because I never had interface with the actual people. It's all, very confidential. So
okay.
especially to students who have um, you know, no degrees at that time. But later, definitely when I started working in refugee resettlement, and was, interviewing people myself for their process, yeah, definitely was able to follow in the system to see if they, were able to go to the US and so on.
Okay, fantastic. Um, so I think that leads us to maybe your second moment of impact when you've graduated Northwestern and you decide to head to Nairobi. Can you tell us a little bit about the structure under which you went there and your
Yeah.
decision?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, like I was mentioning earlier, I thought, maybe I needed a gap year to kind of figure out, again, had this kind of like before law school thought in mind. So I was looking for some sort of fellowship or structure to support me in getting closer to the work and the impact that, I was hoping to have. So I did a fellowship called Princeton in Africa, which is a job placement program for graduates who didn't have to go to Princeton, but around the US and now globally, who wanted to have an impact on the African continent in particular. And I was really interested in the partnership they had with the International Rescue Committee, which is one of the largest organizations, NGOs that's supporting refugees and other people who have experienced conflict and displacement globally. So I was interviewing, I kind of went into my interview process with Princeton in Africa and said, I only want to work with IRC, the International Rescue Committee. And so I was put forward for 5 of their locations, and I actually ranked Nairobi, I think was my last choice, but got put with the Kenya office, and I'm so thankful that I was. It really did change the trajectory of my life. And so, yeah, I was based in Nairobi, Kenya, and was working as a program and grants officer with the International Rescue Committee's country office there. So, supporting their work with refugees in Nairobi, in Kakuma refugee camp, and Dadaab refugee camp.
That's amazing. So you were maybe like 22-ish years old,
Yep,
and
I was 22.
you granted me access to your LinkedIn profile, so I'm just glancing down at some notes. But
Yeah.
so you were overseeing roughly 35 million across 30 grants supporting 500,000 refugees, which is
Yes.
amazing in any regard, but especially as a young person. So what was it like? Like, how did you figure out the job? Where did you live? How did you make friends?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely was supporting this grant portfolio. There was, because IRC is such a big organization, there had, headquarters grants people. They had, the head of the office in Kenya, and my boss as well. But we were really managing, me and one other colleague who was also a fellow at the same time, managing this portfolio of grants. So making sure all the reports came in on time to the donors to facilitate the work, trying to get communications out about them, fill in the necessary information for proposals to donors. So it was really a steep learning curve on the work front. I would say, very luckily through the fellowship and through the IRC's kind of arrangement with Princeton and Africa Fellows, we were able to stay in the IRC guest house, myself and my co-fellow. So an apartment in Nairobi. So that kind of, eased the logistics of figuring that out on my own. And then, yeah, I knew some of the other fellows that were based in Nairobi with other organizations. So that was really like my first, source of friends. And I'm so grateful that I had them because we were all kind of going through this process of relocating, of, supporting organizations based in Nairobi. It was actually my first time on the continent when I moved. And I don't think anyone else, I think everyone else had been at least or intern or something before. So I felt especially, out of my realm. And also I did feel like I was very young, with all of my colleagues and kind of socially as I started to make more friends. Yeah, I just kind of always felt like I was the youngest person in the room, and that has kind of been true for the past 10 years. I'm 33 now. Maybe in the past year or so there are some people that are now younger than me in my workplaces, but yeah, I kind of have felt that for a long time, but really learned the ropes there at the beginning.
That's great. It probably has helped you accelerate your confidence because you care so much about the
Yeah.
causes you're supporting through your work, and to have your voice factor into the equation. Would you say maybe it's helped you develop your voice earlier professionally?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think at the beginning it was a lot of like imposter syndrome and humbling in a way for me to be like, I don't know anything. Like, I am just learning rapidly. But I think as I started to come into my own and remembered like the age at which I started doing this work and have seen things and kind of starting from observing and learning first,
Mm-hmm.
I was able to be validated and like, no, I do actually know what I'm talking about. I think I'm still, learning, and especially from the people who have lived experience of, conflict and displacement most of all. But um, yeah, I think it definitely, forced me to have a stronger voice, to be constantly questioned by myself and by other people. And to, at the end of the day, remember that, if I don't believe in myself and what I'm speaking to professionally, then others won't. So that doesn't mean I can't admit when I'm wrong or I don't know something or there's a better person placed to answer a question. But yeah, I really had to like believe in myself first and foremost.
I love that answer about, being open, being curious, but also, stepping forward. So that's great. So in your work, you said you went on a 10-day field visit to the, I don't know how to pronounce it properly, Kakuma refugee camp.
Yes.
What is that like? I personally have never been to a refugee camp. It's possible other people listening to this, like, can you set the scene or paint a picture a little bit what that was like when you went there?
Yeah, definitely. So that was my first time, you know, being in a refugee camp visiting. So Kakuma refugee camp is in the Turkana region of Kenya. So it was a short flight to get there. So yeah, how do I explain this to listeners without visuals? I mean, I would definitely encourage people also to look up photos to go along as you're listening. But it is very expansive, more than I had ever imagined, and it's just like flying over. Imagine a desert with. Essentially a community or a small city that's made up of really temporary housing solutions. And yeah, so that was kind of my first impression flying in. And then everyone is kind of living in compounds, thinking about the humanitarian workers who are there. So I was staying in an International Rescue Committee compound, which are kind of small trailers where people live and where we have offices, and a dining hall and things like that. But then we would go out and see the health center that IRC was running, a women's group that was meeting, and just see kind of the community gatherings. And Kakuma Refugee Camp is also very diverse in terms of the different places where the refugees were from. So we had, Somali refugees who were there, Ethiopian and Eritrean, for example. So kind of a wide range of different populations. So I was really struck by how diverse it was, all of the activities that the refugees themselves were kind of leading and developing, to make the best of their situations, and also all of the programs that humanitarian workers were running.
That is painting a really good picture, and we'll put some links to this episode. But can you expand a little bit on that last point about how the refugees were self-organizing, in addition to what the humanitarians were providing? Like, what would be an example of something that they would be doing to make their life seem better?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that I don't think I understood in this 10 days, but I later learned. But whole marketplaces created by refugees themselves, creating stores, and what to like the quote unquote naked eye wouldn't necessarily think that this is like a full operational restaurant or store, just really like running these businesses, creating this space also for socialization, but ways to support their families as well. Selling goods, selling food, a number of different things, having solar stations set up, and making a business out of people coming to plug in their phones. Yeah, just really like a lot of entrepreneurship. Um, Selling clean cook stoves, things like this. So that aspect came out really strong for me. And then I would say, the women's groups, at least the one I saw at that time, I think technically was supported by the International Rescue Committee, but it's really reliant on community leaders to facilitate those discussions. So, strong women leaders from the community being the ones to take it forward because no one is going to sit down with, me, for example, if I come in not knowing anyone from that community. So there really is a need from the humanitarian actors as well to rely on these refugee leaders to, provide these types of services.
I love that. It's the whole theme of the people on the ground in the situation know what's needed best. They know best how things should be delivered, how messages should be portrayed, and they're the ones that know how to allocate the resources. So I love how even so early in your career, you were aware of this empowerment angle to humanitarian aid. We're not trying to create a system of dependency. We're trying to
Yeah.
create a system of empowerment. So you ended up being in there for quite a while. I'm looking at my notes, and I guess I had just kind of a general question.
Yeah.
When we talk about adjudicating claims, but we're talking about, let's talk about in the context of Nairobi and the refugees that were in that, I guess you flew, but in that region.
Yeah.
What is the governing body that's on the counterparty to their claims, right? Like you talked earlier at Northwestern, you had two
Yeah.
streams of work, but one was looking at country of origin claims for people coming to settle to the U.S., and the U.S. immigration officers would interview them. Now we're
Yeah.
moving to a different context where we're on the African continent, and these
Yeah.
people have refugee claims. For someone that doesn't understand the system, like who's the counterparty? What's the International Bill of Migrant Rights and so on?
Yeah. So that's right. After my first year there, I decided I wanted to stay longer. So was lucky enough to get a job with Church World Service and the Resettlement Support Center for Africa, which was a program fully funded by the U.S. government that was kind of facilitating interviews to be done for those refugees in the process of going to the U.S. So backing up a little bit, the cases that are identified as, going down the path of to the US or to, let's say Finland, another country would be the UN, United Nations Refugee Agency or UNHCR. So those would be the first people to identify, who is a population that needs to be resettled because there are particular concerns they're facing or a number of different reasons. And then they would be referred to the process that I was a part of. So I'll speak to that of going to the US. So it's a really thorough process that takes years. So there's the initial referral, and then it does end up going up to the US government officials who will decide yes or no at the end of the day. And they do fly in as well. So I was the person kind of in between those two processes. So we would do interviews, try to articulate refugees' stories and experiences to highlight how they were meeting the refugee definition. So this is something that is in, international law. So there is this existing body of law, and then the U.S. Has the definition of a refugee that meets the 5 criteria of fleeing a country based on their, ethnicity, nationality, race, and some others. But that is what the U.S. Abides by when ultimately an official from USCIS, which is under the Department of Homeland Security, would come and say, yes or no to this person, meeting the definition, also having passed through a number of security checks throughout the process that are run by the US government.
So when you were with Church World Service and staying on after your first year as a Princeton fellow, and then you were helping with these refugee claims, you would be directly talking with people, families in the refugee camps, right? And you happen to be fluent in French, but how did that work? Like, were there translators, and were you trying to extract certain elements of their story that you knew would, quote unquote, legitimate, I hate to use that word, but like validate their claim? Like, what was it like to sit down with someone that's been through all of this, that has years ahead of them? Can you kind of paint a picture of what an interview like that is like?
Yeah, definitely. So we would have translators or interpreters with us. So, if I'm sitting at my desk now, on the other side of the table would be, an individual or a family. And we would, if it's a family, interview the whole family and then individuals. And then next to me on my right would be an interpreter that's there kind of on my side. I'm speaking directly forward, but they're also interpreting in real time to make sure that, the communication is as clear as possible. And as time went on, I would, maybe pick up a couple of words where I would be like, wait, I think that's not exactly what I was trying to say, or something like that. But yeah, definitely so grateful to all of the interpreters that I've worked with. And so, yeah, we would do some, initial kind of explaining of the process. And we used to have like a laminated map that's like, okay, you're at this point. Here are all of the steps that you will need to go through. And I think we were step like 2 or 3 of the full process. So we did have that. Obviously, that's something that's articulated in, every step to try to be as transparent as possible. And then some of it, to be honest, was kind of like basic or administrative information. So who is part of your family, confirming everyone's names, birth dates, school certificates, things like this, just so when they go through these really intense security checks that the US government would run, we would try to make sure that the information that they gave us was only helping their cases and not hurting it. So that takes a lot of time, to be honest, and we also take their pictures, and yeah, there's kind of a whole process with that. But then really getting to the claim, we ask them, or I would ask them, why did you flee your country and why can't you go back? And those are really the essential questions. So would listen to, their stories and kind of map out again, from their point of if there was any incidences before. Every situation is different. Sometimes it's, a war that's happening or a group that's being targeted, but they are fleeing preemptively. And sometimes there was a canon event that caused someone to flee. So we would cover their history of flight. So really getting into the details of like, okay, this month you were here, then you went here, here's who you were traveling with, here's who you met along the way. And yeah, just going through those details. And a lot of it is just trying to make sure that there isn't confusing information that someone might question, if they don't know the full story of the flight, of how this person went from A to B, and also, of course, why they fled and why they can't go back. So trying to just articulate it in a way that does hit the main points that the U.S. adjudication officer or refugee officer would be looking for. So do they meet the refugee definition, and why can't they go back there today? So they're still being the same, groups in that context where they fled, they would still be targeted. Maybe they have been targeted already, even while they're away. So really just highlighting those things in a way that made sense, both with the timeline and also lining up with, the refugee definition.
Yeah, and I would think as someone whose charge is to hear and accurately portray why they're fleeing and why they can't go back, that it would be emotionally challenging, and you're probably hearing some stories of trauma and persecution. How did you, as a young person, I mean, you're only a couple years out of college, how did you protect your own emotional well-being in these interviews? And were people openly sharing stories of trauma?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yes, people were openly sharing, and unfortunately, it's like to explain why they had to flee, it often is based in these traumatic events, from sexual violence to watching their family be killed, watching their friends be killed, being threatened in different ways. And yeah, I heard this, either twice to 5 times a day. I ended up becoming a reviewing officer, so would just at the end of that position be having 5 interviews a day. So got to the point where, yeah, I was hearing this very often, and I think to protect myself, unfortunately, I had to kind of build a wall to be able to hear these stories. And also, as a professional, you can't help really tearing up, but someone that's supposed to be helping you crying in front of you also is not helpful to them. So I really tried to find the balance, and maybe I never found the perfect balance, but of being like, empathetic, always giving people moments to collect themselves when they would also be emotional and telling their stories. But I really tried to keep it into myself. And I think that's something that I, at the time would define as some vicarious trauma of kind of having this numbness that I developed to be able to listen to these stories and not be affected while I was hearing them. And so, yeah, I think there's been a lot of kind of a reworking of that since those experiences. But I do believe that I felt at the time it was the best for the people that I was interviewing, and also for me to be able to get the job done. The not as interesting part of it was after we would be on our laptops trying to, get these stories really refined and move them to the next step as quickly as possible. And I would also say that with that organization, the CWS or Church World Service Refugee Support Center, we would travel in groups for most of the time. So I would be, with groups of from 5 to 20 other colleagues, including, Kenyan colleagues, some other American colleagues, who were, let's say around the same age or a bit older. So we could talk to each other without, disclosing the specifics of a certain case, unless it was to a supervisor who had that authorization. But we could really lean on each other. And I definitely leaned on those colleagues and friends during that time to just be like, ugh, I had a really hard case today. Or sometimes it was even like, just like a normal job, like I had someone who was really difficult today, like kind of the range of the gambit. But yeah, there are definitely some cases, where I was interviewing children who are, didn't have parents, and it was a 15-year-old who was parenting their group of siblings, and they were trying to get resettled. And when you asked about cases that I followed before, like that's definitely one that I followed very closely to make sure that they did get resettled, and they did. We don't contact them once they are, but just knowing that they were in a safe space. Yeah, like I really care about all of these, hundreds of people and families that I met, but in a way, we also are blocked from, for security reasons, from we, don't take their contact information, but could at least follow along in the process to see that they did make it to the US, which was our aim.
I'm so glad to hear that there's some type of closure from your emotional and professional investment in their lives and their future safety. So that's beautiful. I think we're going to want to go to your second moment of impact in a second, but I saw in the notes, I think when you were with Church World Service, did you lead field missions to Ethiopia, Burundi? I don't know how to pronounce, to Djibouti, how do you pronounce it? Like, do you want to
Rudy.
just maybe do a quick little
Yes.
description of these field missions?
Yeah, definitely. So, part of the missions were with a team, and that's when I worked in Dadaab, Kenya, and Kakuma, Kenya, which, I had been familiar with before, but also, yeah, was traveling to Rwanda, Ethiopia, and many other countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And then I also, part of my role during that period was working on family reunification. So for refugees who already had family that had gone, let's say, 2 years before to the US, that were trying to bring their sister, their child, or whoever it may be to reunite with them, I had the role of doing solo field missions to go and do the same type of interview that I was doing before, but we also did DNA testing. So talk about all of the things that are required for refugees to get to the U.S. But that was to confirm that if someone says, this is my brother, that they really are. So it would just be me going along. I didn't do the swabbing myself, but working with a medical, nurse or another professional to collect the sample. And then I was tasked with kind of bringing that with me into the next, place where I was able to mail it through the partners that we were working with. Trying to facilitate that family reunification. So through that, I did go to Djibouti. I went to Cameroon. I went to there's so many different places that I went. Sometimes it's hard for me to remember, but
Right.
yeah, that was the solo mission part of my journey. And I would say, yeah, reflecting on how important it was to, have my colleagues around me, I would say those trips were some of the most challenging in a professional development way, but also very hard personally. And yeah, remember one time my luggage was completely lost and refugee files were lost, and I was alone and had to figure that out in Cameroon. And wear the same pair of clothes for multiple days. Things that I really had to figure out of, all on my own. How am I going to do this? How I'm going to make sure that first and foremost the interviews get done, because these refugees also sometimes have to travel to where I was to do the interviews as well. So yeah, lots of learning in those few years.
Yeah. Amazing. So, what caused you to think about getting more education? What would you say your second moment of impact is, Rebecca?
Yeah. So I think my second moment of impact was when I was, still doing the case interviews for refugee resettlement, and I remember being in Tanzania in an area that was close to the border with Burundi, and also relatively close to Congo, or the Democratic Republic of Congo. So that was the major population. And just so many women sharing their stories of, surviving gender-based violence. And I remember also them sharing these things with me. And as I mentioned, I kind of had built this wall up. And I remember one woman just saying, like, I don't want to tell this to you. You're too young. You won't understand. And at the time, I like disagreed with her. I was like, of course I understand, this is my job, said it in a professional way, but internally I was kind of frustrated that someone would question me. And now, I'm still young, but I've lived a lot more life and have my own experiences and really like totally understand what she was saying of why is this person trying to get me to explain the details of this traumatic event when she's not from here, doesn't understand the context, doesn't understand that experience. So that, yeah, also just made me question a lot of things. But most of all I could do at that time was make referrals. So if someone shared that experience, I would say, would you like to be referred to get psychosocial support or something like this? Also knowing that there is limited support that could be provided. So even if I did make referrals to the UN Refugee Agency or other partners, it wasn't sure that someone would get individual counseling sessions or something like that that would be so needed, just because of the limited resources and hundreds of thousands of people having these needs. And I just felt kind of helpless. I felt like I'm a wheel in the chain of the process of people going to the US, where ultimately, yes, they would have an easier life in some aspects, but what they needed right then was, immediate health care, immediate psychosocial support, mental health support, school for their children. There were schools and are schools in every refugee camp, but these are the things that people who are humans just like us are worried about on their day to day. And I felt like I had no agency to support that. I was kind of just part of this larger process. So I really wanted to go to school and specialize in being able to either provide or advise on, helping women who are victims of or survivors of gender-based violence, children who are separated from their parents and who have experienced trauma, and also kind of generally programming for mental health and psychosocial support and other kind of well-being programs to improve people's lives so they don't have to wait, 5 years to get to the US, let's say, and then maybe get access to more services. So that really was what made me make that decision.
Yeah, that's a very profound share. I really appreciate you sharing that. And it is like your interview work is such a double-edged sword because it can seem intrusive, but the intrusion is in service of the documentation in order to extricate them from their situation. But then there's the whole relived trauma, and then there's the carryover of the trauma onto you. So I mean, it's really very, very complex work. And I think we might have to fast forward a lot because I do want to get to some of your other chapters. So maybe talk about after you completed your master's in public health at Columbia's Mailman School of Public Health. And your incentive was to have these trainings and certification. You are certified in trauma and psychosocial services. How did that inform your next chapter of work? And what did you do next?
Yeah, no, thank you. So I have now, a master's in public health and a certificate in forced migration and health. And I've done since some trainings that are specific to kind of like facilitating peer support groups and other things like that. So that was kind of like the tip of the iceberg. But what I did next was I really wanted to be back in the field and be able to be a part of programming and not only the refugee resettlement work. So I, applied to many jobs, but my dream job at the time was to work with the United Nations Refugee Agency, UNHCR, in protection, which is kind of humanitarian speak for social workers, social services for, vulnerable groups or people who have experienced events that have, increased their need for services. So that was what I was applying for, and I applied through this program called the Junior Professional Officer Program with the UN system, or JPO, and got the position to be a JPO Associate Protection Officer in Eastern DRC, or Democratic Republic of Congo. So that was really my dream. And yeah, I graduated in May and left for that job in September of 2019. So that kind of, yeah, was another huge learning and impact phase, I would say.
Can you tell us a little bit about what it means to be a junior protection officer in the field? So you're in the Congo, and your mission is to try to provide services to protect refugees. Can you just kind of paint an example of what a typical day looks like, or anything you recall?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, as an associate protection officer, I had a boss above me and then was working with a team of around 10 people, mostly Congolese colleagues who were supporting these types of services. And we were supporting both Burundian refugees, so refugees from Burundi who were in the part of Eastern Congo where I was, in South Kivu, as well as Congolese people who had been internally displaced, so had fled somewhere within Congo and stayed also in the country. So what that looked like on day to day, it really varied, but I would go, once or twice a week at least to the refugee camps for Burundian refugees, and there were two of them near me, so would go and just, try not to have it be a thing of like we need to plan these things whenever Rebecca comes to the camps, and just really like observed, monitored the systems and the services that were ongoing. So we worked with different partners who were providing this psychosocial support. Interviewing those who had experienced gender-based violence or other traumatic events. And then those people would refer them for either further counseling or services, like if medical services or others were needed. So I kind of describe it as like a manager of social workers. So just reviewing the cases, if there were any urgent needs, like if someone needed to take a flight for a legal activity or medical care. Unfortunately, I would be facilitating that because that takes further resources. Also overseeing the programs with children. So there was essentially a community-led foster care system that I supported through this role, and my colleagues and partners, where they would monitor the cases of children who were separated from their families for various reasons. It was a very small team, so ended up covering some education programming as well along the line. So that was, for refugees. And then for internally displaced people, there were community-led protection centers. So these were already existing for years, let's say, centers where communities would gather amongst themselves and monitor if there was a conflict and people came into their area. They were the first ones noting how many people we have, what are the services needed, and then we, or I in my role, really said, okay, how can we support these groups? So providing them with materials like laptops, notebooks, even things like this, and also with cash to disperse to internally displaced people that would help them build shelters or just get essential services. So it's a wide array of things, and it was very very volatile, both in the context and also in what I was doing. But yeah, it was like the greatest and hardest work experience of my life.
Yeah. And you were there many years, I think.
2 years, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And then I think your moment of impact from that work, your third one, was really thinking about, talk to me about the third moment of impact.
Yeah, so I think it was kind of like extended. I was in Congo for 2 years and then in 3 years with UNHCR headquarters in Geneva. But through my field experience and seeing how much communities were the ones responding after any conflict, also experiencing, my organization having gained and lost funding during the time I was there, and we weren't able to provide services, seeing how communities really step up. So that was kind of starting my moment of impact there. And then when I was in headquarters in Geneva, I really tried to advocate and bring all of my learnings from what I learned in Congo and, previously through refugee resettlement. But I was able to work with an advisory board of organizations led by, refugees, internally displaced people, and stateless people, and help build that advisory board to advise the global leadership of UNHCR. So advising the programs for, the 13,000 staff and the millions of people that they work for. So that really showed me, how amazing these leaders are who have lived experience, and how I really wanted to dedicate, my career from that point on to being able to support those people with lived experiences to use their voice and make changes in the humanitarian response, sector as a whole, and also be able to support their own communities.
So, Rebecca, how would you phrase the impact that you care about at this stage in your life based on the journey that you've had?
Yeah, hard to sum that up, but I would, say that the impact I care about is helping people's lives, in all phases of experiencing either conflict or disaster and displacement. So, first of all, making sure that they can access their basic human rights, and then better yet, most importantly, other services and programs that help them live dignified lives no matter what they've experienced. And this has, kind of expanded from my primary focus on forced displacement and working with refugees to kind of anyone who has been affected by a conflict or a natural disaster, and just being able to improve and provide access to dignity and services for those affected. I'll stop there for now.
I love that so much because in my own life, in my own work, I've seen the power of storytelling when you feel empowered that you're in a safe space and you can actually share your story on your terms, the way you would describe it. It can be so healing, but also very empowering, and having you have a sense of reclaiming your identity, reclaiming your power, reclaiming your voice. And so
Absolutely.
I think, conflicts and displacement journeys are kind of Six Sigma on the bell curve of traumatic experiences, but we see people experience trauma and conflicts everywhere in the world every day of their lives. And so I really was so excited to have you on the podcast, because I think as a young person, you really trained yourself to develop the professional skills and the experiences to become someone who can create that safe space for people to heal, to seek safety, and to be empowered. So it's really such a gift to have had you on today. And I guess I'd like to close on two things. The first one would be, what advice do you have to people that want to pursue humanitarian work, and also to people that have full-time jobs, but they want to do something on a volunteer scale?
Yeah, I would say for people who want to pursue humanitarian work, it seems like a really difficult time, and it is a really difficult landscape, especially, with the defunding and dismantling of U.S. aid in the U.S. and the ripple effects. But I would say don't give up. It's true, the job market is not the best, but I think there are other ways to support, which I'll speak on. And I think it's really more important now than ever. And it's by design that the current situation is making people feel like it's not. So, yeah, don't give up. Don't give up on these people, communities that are facing conflict and are not getting the resources and support they need. And yeah, so I would say, for either young people and also people who have full-time jobs and want to get involved, there are volunteer opportunities, even in your own communities. Unfortunately, if I'm based in Washington, D.C., and when the federal workers were furloughed, World Central Kitchen was there to provide meals. Just as an example, there are organizations like this that deploy on the ground that you can sign up to volunteer for these organizations. I think giving money, even a little, goes a long way. And I would really advocate for supporting local responses, locally led organizations, and work, because even especially with those organizations who don't get, these big global funds, it can go a very, very long way. And it will take, all of us coming together and giving $50 or even $5 to start, covering that gap that has been left currently.
Thank you for saying that, because I think that while we are in this current moment of defunding, we still have the future ahead of us, and we need to pull together collectively and use our voices to advocate for peace and for safety and for inclusion and the gifts of diversity. So thank you for your work, which has been 100% geared through your whole career journey to create that for people. And I'd like to close on our final question, Rebecca. What gives you hope?
Yeah. Well, thank you, first of all, for summing up what I just said in a really beautiful way. What gives me hope would be, that the communities that are the most affected by these crises are still responding. And I've had the privilege to work directly with these leaders that are responding in the toughest of circumstances and building organizations and systems and ways to help despite it all. So I'm so inspired by them, and my next career steps are going to be to see how I can continue to support this work, but I hope it will inspire you all as well.
Thank you. That's a beautiful note to close on. And Rebecca, you have made such a beautiful impact in so many people's lives, and a ripple effect to their families, people that you never even met. And I think it's so helpful to share how your journey went from, documenting asylum cases to interviews to being a protection expert to moving into working with partners and funders and working at corporate HQ of NGOs. So a lot of varied contexts, but all thematically unified to help people have safe and prosperous lives. So thank you so much, and we'll be following you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.